the colonial mind is the mind of, on the one hand, yes, like limitations and boarding schools and strict rules around this and that, and like you can't do this and you can't do that, and stifling corsets and this whole restriction of culture. But the colonial mind is also coming through the people who were escaping all that and saying, we can do whatever we want. Look, we've landed in the shores of, this uninhabited quote unquote land, and we get to do whatever we want whenever we want. And the colonial mind can't decide whether it is like, it wants to grant itself infinite permissibility on the one hand, but then it's like, oh, no, 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 you can't do that. But like, oh, but my freeform circle permits me to do everything. And like, it's in this
Yeah,
crazy
yeah,
pendulum swing
yeah.
between, what it allows itself to do and what it feels that others shouldn't do.
Josh Schrei, welcome back to the podcast. Good to see you, man.
Good to see you. Thanks for having me back. Good to be here.
Yeah, I think you're one of the few return guests. Over the past 7 years I've been doing this thing, there are certain people who I just want to keep the conversation going with. And,
Mm.
definitely there's like a lot of overlap in the things that we're interested in and our work revolves around. So you're one of those guys. It's been a while since we checked in and people enjoyed our last conversation. And so I thought, let's pick it up.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good to be back, and I see your posts, and sometimes they're actually uncannily aligned with things that I'm thinking at that particular moment. So
Yeah,
uh, definitely
same.
feel tapped into a similar wave dynamic of exploration, and happy to be here.
Yeah. And I think like, all of the work that I do comes out of my own curiosity and my own exploration. And then it's just like this feeling of sharing it with the world. I think in some ways to find kinship with others. Like if I put
Mm.
out some of the ideas that I'm wrestling with or thinking about, and put them out there, they'll find the right people, and then they might find me, and we find this place of connection around some of these ideas that are outside of the mainstream for the most part. Is that the same kind of driver of your work?
Yeah, it's very similar. I feel like I want to have a antenna that's attuned to the sometimes unspoken currents and flows of sociocultural dynamics and what's going on in the world at any given time, not from a news standpoint, but from, the barometer of the felt cultural heart. And within that, I have my inquiries and investigations that are shaped by what I see people talking about, um, and I always want to return to what I understand to be like animate perspectives on those topics, and through that, yes, absolutely, to connect and network with people who, in this time, we have to hold each other as best we can. And there are different ways of holding each other. And one of the ways is to, um, dive into and bring light to, hopefully, um, you know, topics of deep cultural, personal, spiritual inquiry, and see what comes of those deep dives.
Hmm. Yeah. I think since the last time we talked, it looks like, I mean, it seems from the outside that the Emerald's gotten quite a bit more popular. At least I get more people recommending it to me as if I've never heard of it before. And I go, well, yeah, I've talked to Josh and I know about it and we're on the same wavelength and all of that. But definitely it seems like it's reaching more people or more people are finding it. What do you think it is that's drawing people to your work specifically?
Yeah, there has been growth over the last couple of years, and I feel that in these times of what has been kind of loosely called meaning crisis, in these times in which some of the larger sociocultural narratives about what life is all about and what we're here to do have pretty much tanked,
Yeah.
pretty much failed. That people are wanting something deeper, and they're wanting a remembering and a return, to something that is simple but has formed part of the human way of seeing and being for a very long time. And that has to do with story, and it has to do with myth, and it has to do with ritual, and it has to do with animacy, and remembering the breath of life, the spirit of life. And I just feel in these times that people are going to be more and more and more called to those voices that are saying, "Hey, remember, remember, you know,
Mhm.
remember where you are, remember what land you sit on, remember the species of tree that are immediately around you. Remember the songs that used to reconnect you when we would forget, or reconnect us when we would forget. Remember the inherent ways of knowing and seeing that cross cultural divides and have the promise of reconnection at their heart."
Yeah. I think one of the things that people are often looking for is to remember like where they come from
Mm.
too. And I've seen, I think what I'm seeing, you never know like if the algorithm's just feeding you stuff that you're interested in or that you're, searching for or whatever. But it seems to me that there's a lot more people interested in mythology and like looking at fairy tales and old stories. And I think part of that is like remembering who you come from. Um, and the other thing that I noticed, like, coming up, I was born in 74, so I was coming of age in the 90s, and there was a big surge of popularity in mythology back then. There was the mythopoetic men's movement, but there's a lot more going on around myth. There's all these like books from the 90s from like, that Bear publisher, and they always have that kind of funky 90s design to the covers and stuff. It's like a little bit granola, but just like it's like the dawn of the Macintosh. So everything kind of has like weird geometric shapes and stuff just because people could now.
Yeah.
But I love those old books. But it seems like, it's a 30-year cycle. It's come back around again. And people, maybe more so than looking toward like Eastern traditions and things like that, where people were looking for meaning. They're looking to stories from the places where their people come from. Are you finding the same thing? Are you seeing that pattern?
Yeah, I mean, the 90s are having their Saturn return right now, so it's actually not from that astrological perspective, it's not an accident that things move in 30-year cycles, and you can kind of see that in like everything from music trends to fashion trends. And all of a sudden like 90s camo is back again, and like a lot of 90s influenced music, and early 90s baggy jeans and all this kind of stuff. From what I've noticed, there's like a 90s resurgence. I've been meaning to do a 90s episode for a couple years now. I've been actually promising to do a 90s
Hmm.
episode, and it got like sidetracked with all the important stuff going on in the world that I felt I had to address. But the thing with me is I never really got out of the 90s. Like
Yeah, me neither.
I I think the 90s was the best decade of music ever. There was such technological innovation in the 90s that it allowed for musical art forms to come into being that had never existed before. And really every musical style that's come since has been a derivative of 90s music in one way or another. And the 90s was also the last time when we had like what you could call kind of mythopoetically free space in
Hmm.
consciousness that was not completely Google mapped. And we had time to dream and time to envision. And I think that's actually an important piece that I want to get into in that episode. Because the story of consciousness since then, obviously there's been a tremendous amount of interconnectivity that's resulted from the internet, but the story of consciousness since then has been one of kind of, I would say, like recycled entanglements. So I have a deep love of that time period, and I was part of that rise of I mean, my family was part of the rise of interest in spiritual tradition far before the 90s. But in the 90s, when I was coming of age, also is when it kind of became my own, and my own inquiry and my own study. And I think that it's, yeah, no accident that that's back. I mean, I see a lot of different things because I'm also in a lot of circles in which people are, studying Tantra and studying Afro-Brazilian traditions and this kind of thing. So I see people, I see there's a reclamation of like Celtic ancestral wisdom among white people. But then I also see that there's still ongoing deep interest in other traditions from around the world as well.
Mhm. Yeah, I think I've been thinking about this recently, and I've had conversations with the writer Eric Davis about this because we're both, Gen Xers, and like you, there was something special about the 90s that the nostalgia I have for the 90s hits me so hard sometimes that I want to die. And so I'm often watching movies from that period, and they're like a comfort food for me. When the highest technology was like the flip phone or the monochrome monitor, Um, but I think like what happened with the onset of the internet is like the death of the underground. And that's something I've been thinking about recently is like the importance of having an underground counterculture. And as a place of like kind of preservation of certain ideas without getting them corrupted, by the mainstream or commodified in some way. And I think like the internet now is just such a marketplace of ideas and personalities and e-courses and all the rest of it that I don't know, there's something about like wanting to keep the underground or keeping what I do somewhat underground and being okay with that and actually valuing that.
Yeah, I mean, everything needs time and space to root. Everything needs time and space to take hold within us. And the point of spiritual exploration is not to immediately turn it around and post about it, and then, like immediately turn that into a life path career. The point of that type of deep exploration, the point of creative exploration, is to find those spacious frontiers of consciousness where we can dive into places of deep remembering. And in those places of deep remembering, we might receive an insight or a vision or a dream. And that insight or vision or dream might take years to root and come to be within us. It might take years to actually embody in the individual body or in the body of a community. And that process, when you're talking about nostalgia for the 90s, I think about driving down mountain roads that were unmapped as far as I knew, and no Google Maps to tell you where you were going, and out with a couple friends listening to a mixtape and trying to find that place where you could, find that rock formation or those cliffs or that view of the sunset that, you didn't know if it was there or not, but there was nothing to tell you that it was there. There was no clutter. There was no, and once you found that place, it was for the experience itself. It was for being there. It wasn't for, how can I turn this into content? And this is it's a little thing, and everyone's aware of this kind of tendency in the modern mind. But just because everyone's aware of it, and just because it's a little thing, doesn't mean that it's also not hugely impactful on our psyches.
Hmm.
And the notion of disappearing into mythic and dream spaces just for the sake of disappearing into mythic dream spaces, or of, you know, meditating and doing practice, doing whatever it is, whatever type of ritual practice we do for the actual alchemy that happens within us, as opposed to like have it be part of some lifestyle piece, right? You know, this is really important. This gets at like why we're actually here. Like we need wide open spaces, and we need spaces of deep remembering, and we need to make room and time for alchemy to happen. And a lot of the teachers I've studied with in my life aren't on the internet at all.
Hmm.
Um, they aren't sometimes, people will come to me and be like, hey, I want to know where to study, and I'm very careful about not recommending spiritual paths to people because you know that's a person's own experience. Like they have to make that choice, right? Like, but like the understanding that you could study in a tradition and find a ritual practice and practice that practice for years and really never make it into anything that you talk much about or publicize or anything like this. Like a lot of this has gotten lost in the modern world. We're very aware of the camera's eye looking at us. We're very aware of the posts that we're going to write about afterwards. And I think that in whatever way possible, returning ourselves to those lost, unknown mountain roads where we can actually encounter something, where we can enter the mysterious world and bring back a little gem, and grow it within ourselves slowly. I think this is called for in times that immediately want to grab a hold of our attention, take it outwards, and have us turn it into ideology immediately, or have us turn it into marketing immediately. I think I think we need space to practice, space to grow. I don't know if
Yeah.
that follows along what you're talking about, but
Yeah, I don't know. I'm just following it. So I think, there's something there that's really resonant though, and it's like I think has something to do with the separation between sacred and profane space. And when we take something like a practice that we're doing in hopefully a sacred space and we bring it out into the profane, like it's like something, I think something is lost in that, that kind of the specialness of the privateness of it, or it's just like something that's happening within myself or with some energy or some entity or whatever, and bringing it out into the kind of public square for display, whatever your motivation is. um, yeah, I think something is lost there, and there's something of like an intelligence in keeping the mystery school a mystery, and that vow of silence that people would take, like there's some real intelligence in that, I think. And I think we're kind of talking around this, like, I don't know.
from my perspective, there is absolutely intelligence in keeping the mystery school a mystery. It's something that is really hard to convey and even talk about in this cultural climate because there's such sensitivity around things like gatekeeping and this kind of thing. But to understand the initiatory process and to understand like the process that a being goes through, in which they start out, kind of young and wide-eyed and eager, but really don't have a place to hold teachings yet, that don't have a place to really keep them and alchemize them and turn them into actual embodied, living. And that journey is alchemical progression. It's a progression, and you know, teachings that say like ultimately there's no progression and you already are perfect and all this kind of thing. It's like those teachings were generally, meant for people who had already been through the progression. So the understanding that like, yeah, um, you know, the things we live in a world that wants us to produce and express all the time. And it's interesting because, expression is something like we want to express in the modern world because we feel that expression has been restrained at certain points in our history. But now kind of expression is what is expected. Like now it's like express, express, post, post, tell me, feed me more. And
Mm.
every time we feed something like that, every time we feed a piece of content out there, that's energy that we're not keeping in and alchemizing and working on. I feel this in relation to the podcast, and I have whole aspects of my practice that I don't talk about at all, that I don't bring to the podcast whatsoever. I share the way I approach it is I share exactly what I feel comfortable enough within my own artistic exploration that I feel that I can share without tipping over the vessel entirely and letting the content spill out, in which case I wouldn't be able to hold any of those beautiful life mysteries, right? because
Mhm.
holding is important, keeping is important. If we look at the dynamics of the human being as a vessel that receives from this great kind of poetic, mythopoetic outflow of the cosmos, right? The the cosmos is in this beautiful state of outflow, and we receive from that outflow, and we want to express it outwards, and that want to express it outwards is totally natural. But we're also called to keep things and hold and grow things slowly, and all of this can be really easily seen in the dynamics of gardening, right?
Mhm.
Like, you have to tend soil before you plant seeds. If you don't tend soil before you plant seeds, then those, if you're just so eager to get the fruit and you're just like, oh, I don't want to worry about the soil, and I don't want to worry about the bed that it sits in, and I don't want to worry about that boundary that's going to keep out all those hungry deer that are going to want to come munch on it, you know
Mhm.
like, you got to think about all those things, and this
Yeah,
is the
yeah.
same with the mysteries.
Yeah, totally. It's a great analogy. Like also thinking about like fruit is produced through an intense concentration of energy. Like that's necessary for the fruit to be produced. That's why you prune an apple tree,
Hmm.
right? And so there's something about that, like about restriction, um, not getting too diffuse, concentrating, focusing that energy. And that's what the container of your personal ritual practice does, or the expanded container of a communal ritual practice. It's one of the things I want to talk to you about is like container.
Hmm.
Um, yeah,
Yeah,
but
let me say one thing on that, and that'll
yeah.
be maybe a good segue towards container, because this is a topic that's really up for me right now, and it's actually going to make its way into some upcoming episodes. Um, yeah, the profoundly beautiful expression of nature that we see everywhere, that is us, that is the explosion of color and sound and sight and smell, that is the forest. This expression finds expression biologically through limitation. It finds expression, like if you study gene expression, it finds expression through limiting most of the signals that want to express to a narrow bandwidth of signals that actually do express. And this is true whether you're talking about how leaves grow or limbs grow in the human body. Like the mandala of expression of nature happens as much through limitation as it does through what we call, like, quote unquote free expression, which is very much a Western concept, the concept of just like, you know, total free form expression. So within that, container and limit and boundary, all of these things, for people who want to study animist tradition, I always say, like, animist tradition, it's beautiful and it's wonderful, and it's wonderful to re-encounter a living world, and in a world that seems so industrial and stark and soulless and numbing, when people encounter animistic, worldview, they get very excited. But there's also a tendency, I'd say, in the modern West to take that and think that animistic, thinking or animist perspective means like this kind of completely free-form, fluid relationship with the living world, in that it's all about, I don't know, like prancing about in the woods the way that the Victorians did when they finally discovered, like, ancient wisdom. And if you look at traditional systems, animism is about relationship and protocol and the limits to human intrusion and how we can be in respectful dialogue with one another, human and non-human, right? There's as much to animism that is about, I don't even like to put it along the terms of limit and freedom, because that's again such a kind of modern way of looking at it. It's like animism is about deep relational protocol, ritual is about deep relational protocol. And yeah, within that, there are deep ecstasies possible, and deep reconnections possible, and profoundly beautiful states of consciousness possible. But those profoundly beautiful states of consciousness ultimately should be reinforcing that deep protocol and relationality, where we feel like, oh, I live in a world of overlapping agencies. and I have to be careful. I have to watch my step. I have to be careful how I walk through the forest. I have to be careful with the local water spirits. I have to take much more care than I've ever had to take before. And this is as much a part of animism, as those ecstasies.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Respecting boundaries. Hey, if you haven't already, take a moment, like this video and subscribe to the channel. It actually really helps. And look, if you really want to support the podcast, consider becoming a Patreon member. Starting at just $5 a month, you get early release of all episodes weeks before they're out to the public with no ads, no interruptions. We do a monthly call where we get together and we talk about topics like the one we're talking about on this podcast, me and you and other cool people. And you get other stuff. There's a private RSS feed that you can subscribe to and listen to extra bonus content on your favorite podcast player. It's really great and it's growing. So go to patreon.com/howl in the wilderness and join up. Yeah, there's something there. I mean, we're kind of like finding our topic. I didn't really know what we were going to talk about today. I just knew we'd start going and something would emerge. But this thing about like limitations, I think, is really interesting. And it goes contrary, I think, to a lot of, I don't know, thought in the new age or the kind of self-development world where the human is meant to tap into or manifest their unlimited potential.
Mm.
And that kind of raises my hackles a bit every time I hear someone talk about unlimited potential. I think like we see the result of that in people like Elon Musk and the kind of transhumanist tech bros wanting to transcend human limitations in all ways, accumulation of wealth, life extension, getting off the earth. All of that, like getting out of the body and having my consciousness implanted in some computer drive or something. Um, so that's a kind of a scary thought to me. Unlimited potential, that idea as a kind of guiding belief principle or something, where that leads, you know. I think we're
Yeah.
seeing it now.
I mean, what I've learned through the traditions I've studied in is that nature is the one of unlimited potential. Nature is the force of nature, the animate force that drives all of this life and movement and change and transformation. This is the force of unlimited potentiality. And that force of unlimited potentiality, we as parts of that unfolding web of unlimited potentiality have the possibility of experiencing deep ecstasies and opening ourselves up to deep creative possibilities and opening ourselves up to profound experiences of connectivity, right? But the deep potentiality that is available to us, the deepest potentiality that is available to us, comes through us through connectivity. It comes to us through relationality. It comes to us through being a part of that evolving, unfolding whole, instead of thinking that the sum total of it is us. And this is interesting because it even gets into some, I think, like, you know, um, convenient misinterpretations of like non-dual tradition, which wants to jump right to like,
Yeah,
I'm the entire universe. It's
yeah,
like,
you can't
I'm the
skip to the
entire,
end.
yeah, it's like, I'm the entire ocean. It's like, okay, you're the entire ocean. Now, that's fine and good philosophically, like to feel that space where we connect to the sum total of everything is beautiful. But the fact of the matter is that when you or I step into the ocean, we have to pay really close attention to the waves. And one of us, either me or the ocean has to change protocols, and it's not the ocean. Like I'm the one who has to adjust
Yeah.
my behavior, as a small drop in this vast ocean. I'm the one who has to adjust my behavior in order to meet the currents and wave dynamics of the ocean. This is relationality. Like this is understanding, like, in a relational system, um, what I'm called to do in a relational system is deeply understand those relationships and those protocols. I mean, this has a lot to do too with like, traditional visions of nature, um, not as quote unquote wilderness, not as a space of just kind of, again, kind of free formness, but as overlapping societies. If you look deep into Indian traditions, it's like, oh, the snake spirits have their society, and the eagle spirits have their society, and the, yakshas and the tree beings have their society, and these are intricate. And, there in the Northwest Coast, I know there's deep protocol around fishing and fishery and salmon runs and the halibut people and what types of treaties are meant to be struck with the halibut people and this type of thing. And
Hmm.
you know it's it's an invitation into, that unlimited potentiality is like the invitation into a relationality with an unfolding web of which I am just a part and need to acknowledge my part within it. And in feeling part of it, yes, I can feel the beauty of the sum total of existence within myself. But that's not the same thing as saying that I, as an individual, get to do whatever I want, whenever I want, however I want. And any time, and this, the number of ways in which this recycles itself in Western discourse are truly phenomenal. Like the number of ways in which, modern Western discourse finds ways to say, well, really, at the end of the day, I want to do whatever I want, however I want. Like, it makes its way, yes, it makes its way into, Elon Musk and people who feel completely entitled to, do whatever they want with vast riches and resources and, send rockets up into space and this kind of thing. But it also makes its way into all kinds of other forms of cultural discourse, too. I mean, it makes its way into what's called like decolonized discourse, in which, like, if the assumption of the decolonial state is like, oh, I'm decolonizing something by getting rid of all the rules, you know, I'm decolonizing something by getting rid of the structure. It's like, well, that might not actually be decolonizing, because if you look at traditional systems, they're very deeply saturated with rules and protocols and organizing systems. So, in the modern West, we tend to want to make the story a story of unlimited individual potentiality free from boundary. And the
Hmm.
story that nature tells around us, which is a story that is mirrored, I believe, in so many traditional systems, ritual systems, the story that nature tells around us is one of interrelationality and protocol and limit.
Hmm. Yeah. There's something like incredibly hubristic about this idea of unlimited human potential. It's almost like you become identified with the one, with the cosmos itself. Like you said, it's an incredibly deep and powerful and transformative experience to experience that. To have that experience of oneness with all and have the dissolution of the individual ego and all of that, like Freud's oceanic feeling.
Yeah.
Um, Wonderful experience. But if you're not using that to kind of decouple your ego as being the sole source of identification, and you're just going into full identification with this oneness, you're going to run into problems because, like you said, the cosmos is made cosmetic through limitation and differentiation and interrelatedness. Um, yeah, so we get ourselves into trouble. But it
Well,
also goes, yeah, go ahead. Go
Well,
ahead.
yeah, and that oceanic state, when I feel that I am the ocean, I am feeling that in a heightened state of consciousness. And those descriptions in the non-dual traditions are descriptions of experiences that you have in particular heightened states of consciousness. They're not saying that you're going to walk around feeling like the entire ocean all the time. In fact, usually what they say in terms of how to live one's daily life has a lot more to do with like relational protocol, right? So you live life according to this relational protocol, even in the non-dual traditions. And then when you're meditating or you're in deep ritual, then you have the oceanic experience in which you can experience that vast ocean. But then when you come back to your normal waking state of consciousness, you don't walk around with a kind of empty grin on your face saying like, I'm the sum total of everything. No, and the Zen, the Zen traditions have stories of like disciples who do that, and then the master comes along and hits them with a stick. I mean, like,
Yeah.
it's seen as a block on the path. It's like, if you're walking around pretending to be the sum total of everything, or that you're all one with everything all the time, or that are tapped into some unlimited potentiality that you get to do whatever you want whenever you want. I mean, that tends to be a marker of like, oh, time to, you know, um, bow at the foot of the oak tree for another 7 years.
Yeah, like yeah, and I mean, there's an interesting play between hubris and humus, like humility, coming back down to earth and realizing like what you actually are, that is built into a lot of systems, right? And but when we co-opt practices, when we jump to the end of some of these practice systems into oneness and non-duality and all of that, um, we miss the part about humiliation and coming back down to earth, right?
Mm.
Speaking of
Yeah.
which, Suki just jumped on my
Oh,
lap,
hey,
so
puppy. Yeah. Dogs are such a profound teacher of humility. Yeah,
yeah,
and unconditional love. Yeah,
and boundaries.
and boundaries. Sometimes.
Well, I don't have many boundaries with her, but
um, yeah, the um,
she always interrupts. She interrupts my thoughts sometimes too. Yeah.
yeah. Well, what you were talking about just made me think of the hubris of calling this age the Anthropocene, and the hubris of, obviously, yes, we're as human beings having a profound impact on the natural world, and but we will find ways to assign ourselves the central role in the story over and over and over and over again, and understanding that there are cycles and forces that are so far beyond our immediate, what each of us has like an 80-year, 100-year vision, 100-year at the most, probably. This isn't even a speck in geological time. It's not a speck in the lifespan of the planet. And within that, when we really realize, like, despite Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk's best effort, like, every single one of us are going to die. And, you know,
Thank God.
geologically speaking, and not very long, if that doesn't bring us down to earth at least somewhat, it's like, what are we rushing for? you know and the only way they can continue this type of frenzied rush is if they convince themselves that there's a way to cheat that code too.
Hmm.
So they're really trying to convince themselves that there's a way to cheat that code, but that's one that the myths are universally clear on. That's the thing that nature never grants. Nature never grants immortality.
Yeah. What do you think is a good story that illustrates that setting of limits?
I mean, the story of Gilgamesh is a great story in that, Gilgamesh is off searching for the the secret of immortality, and I love the scene where he encounters the old kind of yogi figure on the mountain. I'm forgetting his name. It's one of those glorious Sumerian names.
The
And
Enkidu?
no, it's not Enkidu.
No. I don't know the story well.
It's the hermit. Yeah, and it's
Mm.
one of those stories that gets like chalked up to like, oh, that's another hero's journey story or whatever, and it's not. It's extremely critical of its hero
Mm.
and shows a lot of human fallibility through its hero. And one of the parts I love is that, he finds this hermit, he, battles the scorpion guards and finds this hermit who can tell him the secret of immortality. And the hermit says, oh, you want to know how to live forever? Well, it's easy. Just stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights, and then I'll tell you.
Hmm.
Right? And it's just like limits, right? Limits. You can't stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights. I mean, it's like, here's human beings trying to find this like secret of immortality and trying to find all this stuff, and it's like, you know, most of us haven't even found basic foundational facility within our own breath cycle, you know. or within
That's
our
where I tell
own.
people. That's funny. That's where I
Yeah,
tell people to start. Get yourself
exactly.
together. Yeah.
Start with the breath.
Yeah.
Start like I did an episode recently, fairly recently, on guardians and protectors in animate traditions, and like, you know, people like, oh, like, what should I do? Is these elaborate guardianship practices, and then should I burn this, and should I do this perimeter, and should I do this like banishing spell or whatever it is? And it's like, yeah, there are all kinds of practices that set what can be called spirit boundaries and this type of thing. But the first place you want to look is your thoughts.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That
your
boundary.
thoughts are the things that are most likely to lead you into states of precarious unguardedness, right? And if person hasn't found like any ability to alchemize their thoughts at all, you know, no ability to alchemize the thoughts, and yet they think somehow that they should be privy to the highest Kundalini yoga teachings and like the most secret yoga tantra and all those incredibly powerful mantras that, as Staniswar Timalsina says, like people in India or Nepal won't touch them. They're like, nah, I don't think I'm ready for that. But people in the West want them like all the time. It's like, have we learned the basic, you know, like um can we exist with our partner in something resembling, a harmonious exchange, without it all going to crap, like
Mm.
these are the basic things. Like the basic foundations are like, how am I carrying myself in the world? Like, you know like, how am I with my thoughts? Where are my thoughts leading me? How am I with my breath? you
Yeah.
know then you start there, and then like, okay, like there's a
Like,
reason that the mystery schools again had all those years of foundational practices. There's a reason.
mm. Yeah. Start with that boundary around oneself and get that kind of firmed up and then expand gradually, like one to the two, like you said, the intimate relationship. Like I
Mm,
call marriage as, it's an alchemical vessel for transformation if both parties are willing participants, like that vow itself becomes a container, because it's going to keep you, being honoring that vow and being having fidelity to that vow will get you through a lot of the ups and downs, and it allows you to do that work of alchemy. But yeah, there's this idea that everything should be available to us in the West. Again, it's like not an honoring of limits.
mm,
And I guess, one of the things that I wanted to talk with you about is like, okay, how to get into this. But like we're both kind of eclectic scholars. We're interested in a lot of things. We're interested in world traditions. And then we're also practitioners, right? And we both come from, I think both of us, European background. I'm like a European mutt here, displaced in North America, where my recent ancestors didn't bring a lot over with them in terms of tradition and culture,
mm,
even if they had anything to bring over, because at that point we'd already had, what, 1800 years of Christianity suppressing pagan tradition. So a lot of them just maybe came with a little bit of Protestant uh, Christianism or something, right? And so like searching for meaning and searching for ways to be engaged with the world in this animist way. um, what else can we do but like look to living traditions for inspiration and guidance and maybe some techniques that are really useful and I think universal? um, how can we do that without becoming too eclectic, where it's just like the kind of the potpourri of new age practices and ideas, and it's just kind of a mess, and it doesn't really, it's not powerful in some way, or like appropriating too much, where we're just taking from someone else's culture. And so I've been like writing about that recently and like putting together what I call a DIY shamanic practice, which is like basically my version of like something Thomas More covered in his book, A Religion of One's Own, and goes back to Jung's idea of, you know, finding out what myth you're living because the cultural myth no longer fits. And so we're in this unique position of having to like cobble together something new. And so like, yeah, how to like do that in a way that's not too appropriative, but appropriates in a good and creative way, and not becoming too eclectic. Like, do you have any thoughts about that?
I'm laughing because yes, I have some thoughts about
I figured you
that.
might. Yeah, that's why I wanted to talk to you.
I've done a few episodes that talk about this a bit. One of them is called "Let Us Sing of the Syncretic Gods of Outcasts and Wanderers,"
That
and it
sounds like
really,
that sounds like speaking to me.
yeah, like, and it's speaking to a lot of us in the modern world.
Mm.
So I think that there's, like everything else, there's like this kind of pendulum swing of discourse, and you know, there's the very real want to reclaim something and remember something and find a genuine path and find a genuine way of interacting relationally with the cosmos, ritually and relationally. And, there are people who are trying to piece together their own ancestral traditions. And like you said, there are people who are looking to other traditions. And I mean, the first thing that I generally talk about in this topic is that first and foremost, we have to remember and recognize that, you know, whether you call it animism or whether you call it like ritual reclamation, whatever you call it, this nature based relationality, this way of interacting with the breath of life, that this is every human being's foundation and birthright. So no matter where we come from, you know, we have the right to um, to practice and access. All of our ancestors were animists. They didn't even have to call themselves animists. So
Yeah.
normative was it, to quote an older episode of mine. So normative, so foundational was it to the human experience that like 99.9% of your ancestors, 99.9% of my ancestors interacted with ancestral spirits, interacted with the forces of the watershed, interacted with the fire, and saw them as sacred and holy and developed relationality with them. Doesn't
And
mean that
had
99
had songs and prayers and ritual to upkeep that relationship. Yeah.
exactly. Doesn't mean that 99.9% of our ancestors were like amazing, wonderful people, kind all the time, everything like that. There are animist jerks. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, that's important too to the discussion that tends to kind of bifurcate between
Yeah.
modernity and
The
traditionality.
romanticization of
Yeah,
the pagan ancestors and all that.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But it does mean that there is a certain foundational worldview that comes out of our own somatics and our own somatic experience of the cosmos and is deeply embedded in all human beings. And so sometimes now these days, on one hand, there's like a shame among European descended people for like, do I get to do this? Am I allowed? And from, my studied perspective, of course, everyone is allowed. It's like
Yeah.
it's the fabric of what it means to be a human being. So some people get really restricted and guilty around this kind of practice. And then the other side of the pendulum swing is like that kind of I get to do whatever I want whenever I want.
It's all up for
And
grabs. Yeah.
it's all up for grabs. And, you take traditions like Australian Aboriginal tradition, which has some serious walls around it, and those walls have to be respected. You know, yes, it's all of our birthright to be practicing foundationally, but that doesn't mean I'm gonna claim myself to be a Australian Aboriginal like clever man and like go around like giving Australian Aboriginal teachings. Of course not. There has to be a basis of respect. And so when
Well,
traditions are
and yeah, just to say, like, just jump in. They need to have those walls up because
yeah,
they've been so affected by colonialism. And same up here in the Pacific Northwest. There's real thick, tall walls around things like longhouse initiation and things like that, right?
yeah,
So just to say that protection is probably something that came about because of colonialism. like they needed to protect it in order to preserve it.
Yeah, or at least certainly amplified because of colonialism. I mean, there are,
Yeah.
like we were talking about, mystery schools, and so there are hidden teachings in many cultural traditions, but certainly it's survival now. It's survival that there are walls around these things. And for me, it's like those walls have to be utterly and totally respected, right?
Hmm.
There's no two ways about it. So I can hold the need for cultural respect in one hand, and I can hold the fact that, it is everyone's birthright to access the animate in the other hand. You know, I can hold that there are boundaries around culture that need to be set. And then I can also hold that sometimes those boundaries around culture are spoken about a little bit too permanently. In other words, when people say, like, well, can you practice Indian tradition if you're not Indian? It's like Indian tradition. I mean, there's a reason, like, trace the course of Buddhism from India to China to Japan to Thailand and see how it's been culturally assimilated and syncretized in those traditions. And understanding that the nature of tradition itself is that it is, yes, stable in one sense, but that it constantly shifts and changes and evolves, and it's adaptive, and
It's
I-
creative,
it's creative.
just like
And
creation.
yeah, it is
It should
creation.
it should be
And
a mirror of creation. Yeah.
yeah, and so in that episode, I kind of jokingly said, okay, how many people who are listening to this have syncretic altars? Like, how many people have an altar that might have like an image of Kali on it next to an image of Mother Mary, or might have, you know, this is totally natural and normal. You go to Brazil, and where the most of the traditions are syncretic, and it's like you have, Amazonian animate forces next to West African orishas, next to Christian saints, and they're all intermingling, and it's an adaptive, unfolding survival mechanism. And to say that, like, tradition is like this has been the absolutely total unbroken tradition for, forever, it's like in most cases that's not the case. It shifts and it evolves and changes. Now, what I see in relation to your question is that there is a need for depth. So
Hmm.
whether you are practicing something syncretic or you are practicing in a lineage tradition, there's the need for depth. The place where it gets dicey to me, and this relates to the earlier part of our conversation, is when it becomes, I'm just going to dabble in a thousand things, and because there's no actual rootedness to the practice, right? Like, then basically it all happens on my terms, and I get to do whatever I want whenever I want. And there's no real friction, there's no real stakes, there's no real growth mechanism there. There's no real, like, alchemical cauldron potential if there's not some type of depth, some type of deep rhythmicity, some type of, like, yeah, I've committed to do this practice every day for 10 years. Even if, like, who I might be lighting a candle to might shift and change, I've committed to a daily rhythmic friction of doing this particular practice, for a long, long period of time, so that I can develop this depth.
Yeah.
That's what I think is the key. So I'm someone who's studied in multiple traditions in my life, but I've also studied in those traditions for long years at a time. So I see the value of all of it. I think there is tremendous value in syncretically looking at the commonalities and foundations in differing animate practices from around the world. I love doing that. It's what my entire podcast is based on. Um, but within that, you know, it's not just like, oh, well, I'm kind of going to do this today, and then I'm going to forget about it for 3 months, and then I'm going to kind of, no, there's a depth there and a rhythm there. And that comes from, like, a commitment to going deep. And I think when
Hmm.
you have that commitment to going deep, you find, like you're saying, that the foundations are very, 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 very similar everywhere.
Hmm.
There are certain things that are just foundational, and they have a lot to do with everything that we're talking about. limit
Totally.
limit is a big part of it.
That's what I
You
was going to
know,
say. I mean,
like
depth requires limits. Like you have
yeah,
to say, I'm going to dig this hole for the next 10 years rather than dig a bunch of holes around and never hit that deep wellspring.
yes,
Right. And that kind of makes me think about, I think it's something that Peter Kingsley talks about is like the kind of the secret stream through these traditions that on the surface change over time because the the like exoteric part of the religion has to be creative and adaptive and responsive to the times and
mm,
to people's needs. But what makes them potent is their connection to this deep underground stream. Here we go back to the underground again. And in order to reach that stream, you got to like dedicate yourself to digging down, right? When you hit that stream, then you can also be creative with the practice. So I can practice yoga and really understand what it is at its essence. And then spontaneously what's happened for me over decades is new forms come. Like one morning I woke up and there was like these like five forms that I immediately related to the five elements. And I'd learned like thousands of vinyasas and I'd never seen these forms before.
mm,
And they were like they showed up for me. And I tried to teach them to other people and they were like, that's cool. I don't get it. It was like they were just for me. And that's the
mm,
kind of thing that can happen, I think. And that's like both the universality and also the specificity of some of these practices, right?
yeah, absolutely. And you know, I mean, way back at the beginning of the podcast, I interviewed a woman named Tulasi Srinivas who wrote a book about wonder in Indian ritual expression and how Indian ritual expression is continually adapting to bring spontaneity and wonder into the fold. And, um, if like shiny tinsel and loudspeakers blaring, if that'll bring like the vibration of Devi more present for people in their consciousness, then by all means make use of tinsel, make
Yeah.
use of, loud sound systems. Like,
You're
you
talking
know,
about some of those kind of gaudy shrines that you'll
yeah,
see
totally.
in everywhere, like Latin America and India, where the
The thing
Western
is,
aesthetic might be like, oh my God, it looks so trashy or something, or it's so
yeah,
gaudy.
and then the thing is, like, you fast and you go into something of a trance state and you chant along, and then, the time comes for the revelation of darshan where they part the curtains and you see the image. And
Yeah.
in an altered state of consciousness, the shine off that tinsel, like it
Perfect.
works. It
Yes.
takes you right into this space. And that, like, yeah, there's a whole language, there's an aesthetic language, right? I talk about this a little bit in that episode on uh, outcasts and wanderers, but there's a aesthetic language that people who are in that space of ritual adaptation are much more concerned with the aesthetics of what is going to bring us into a rapturous state than they are with, like, you know you have to keep it exactly this way because this is how the tradition has always done it, or sticking to these kind of like extreme cultural walls of like, no, you can't cross this boundary or cross that boundary or cross that boundary. And the Afro-Brazilian traditions are a shining example of this. And saints are possessing nature forces in those traditions. And like, you go with what works, like you
Yeah,
go
yeah.
with what works. And when the animate reshapes and arrives as a piece of driftwood that then becomes an image of the Mother Mary that sends people into trance states of revelation. I mean, there's this incredible story of the Black Madonna in Poland, Częstochowa. I'm maybe pronouncing it wrong, or Częstochowa. The famous Black Madonna image with the three scratches on the face. There's a incredible story of how Polish conscripts in Napoleon's army took that image to Haiti, and the Haitian people adopted that image, and they could relate to her skin and they could relate to the scratches on her face. And she became a possessing entity that then sparked the entire Haitian Revolution. Like
Mm,
she became like one of the, and she's still there. You'll see her all over Haiti. She became one of the primary possessing entities in their rituals that sparked their eventual overthrow of the French, and the Polish ended up siding with the Haitians, and there's still the Polish Haitian descendants living in a part of Haiti. And this is syncretism in all its beautiful glory. This is like, the language in which we are working is the language of rapture. It's the language of spiritual necessity. It's the language of, how do I work with what I've got to take me into that place? And I believe over the next 20, 50, 100 years, in the midst of this meaning crisis, you're going to see so many syncretic traditions rising. You're going to see, some of them are going to be undoubtedly bizarre, and some of them are going to be amazing, and some of them are going to be bizarrely amazing. But this is going to happen, in the United States, in Canada. It's going to happen, especially with the rise of psychedelics too. You're just going to see this type of syncretism, this type of experimentation. Now, I'm all in favor of that experimentation, but then the question becomes, does it remember those foundations? Does it remember, like, there's a foundational heart to all of it, even as that form shifts and changes and spirals? There's a foundational heart to all of it, and that foundational heart, you know, is going to be very similar everywhere you go. The question I have in relation to what you're talking about, the question I have is, what do you do? Like, because you're talking about how the traditions need to morph and adapt to, meet the times that they're in. What do you do when the cultural ethos of the times we're living in runs directly contrary to the tradition? Like that's something I think is a really interesting thing to look at. And you see this in yoga, for example. It's like, and again, this is gets back to what we were talking about at the beginning. It's like, what do you do when the cultural ethos is like, you know, be free and do whatever you want? And, you know, yoga is like, here's how you restrain the mind. Right? Like,
yeah.
yeah,
Or
and
pratyahara, like
yeah, exactly.
moderate
And
what you take
the
in.
yoga
Yeah.
the yoga world is like, there's so much like confusion and smoke coming out of people's ears in the yoga world around this, because it's really trying to turn itself into something like, freeform reactive, and like the celebration of individualist reactivity and this kind of thing. And it's like to make yoga, which is like literally about, limits and
Restraint.
restraints,
Yeah.
and the
Through
very
force.
name of the tradition means like a yoke.
Hatha,
It's like, oh, it means
yoking
to
with
unite. Yeah, it
force.
means to unite. It means a cattle yoke. I mean, it means like to, and the ultimate freedom that one experiences in yoga is through the binding, through the restraint, through the limitation, right? To
Yeah.
talk about that in the West, it's like, you know, um,
Anathema.
yes. And that I wonder about, I wonder, and I see this in reflected in so many ways, and I'm talking about it in an upcoming episode, but it's like how we continue to take spiritual traditions and animate traditions that are ultimately talking to us about things like humility and relationality
Boundaries,
and
limitations,
boundaries, limitations, and step by step, progression
sacrifice, saying
and
no to,
sacrifice and
yeah.
saying no, and like, not following all those impulses. And we just try to take it into the space of permissibility, you know. And again, like that permissibility is, I mean, it's kind of like post-French Revolution, like colonial talk, that permissibility. Like we think it's like, oh, I'm getting in touch with the ancient teaching. I'm shedding all these kind of rules and restrictions and boundaries and getting back to how it always was. It's like, no, how it always was more boundaried.
Yeah, yeah,
how,
like that's
how
like
it
the
al-
whole kind of theosophist line and into the perennial philosophy and that kind of thing. But okay, just to flip it around.
yeah.
Okay, so syncretism happens all over the world except here in Anglo North America, where there's a prohibition against it.
Mm.
right? And so, like, you're asking, like, what does the practice look like when it's counter to the culture? Well, what I see a lot in the culture is people of European descent saying, no, 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 we can't borrow from anybody. You got to, like, and it comes from like the Jungian people. I've heard it in the mythopoetic side, like, don't tell stories that aren't from your lineage, or don't do practices that aren't Western, and all this kind of thing. And to me, that's just like way too limiting and doesn't understand the eclectic, syncretic nature of human culture throughout time and everywhere. There's
Yeah, it
nothing
feels
purely
like,
Western. Like even Jung's Western alchemy, which was like his like, okay, I found it. Here's something that's symbolic, that's gives us more than the Christianity I inherited. But if you look at Western alchemy, I mean, it's a hodgepodge of like Middle Eastern esotericism and Greek thought, and I mean, so
and
when
Greek
the
thought
cult
was a hodgepodge. Greek thought, a lot of
exactly,
Greek thought came from Africa. A lot of it came from Egypt, you know.
well, and Peter Kingsley
Yeah,
would say that some of the most esoteric teachings came from Mongolian shaman.
Siberia. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So like
Um,
when the culture's saying no, you can't borrow, you can't be inspired by all of this, I think then the countercultural response is something like a syncretic practice that does honor the deep stream and doesn't just co-opt. But like, you
yeah,
know, in my latest piece, I quote that Picasso quote, like good artists borrow, great artists steal. And I take that to mean that the great artists, like the difference between borrowing and stealing is borrow, you know, it's still yours. I'm just having it for a while. When I steal, I make it mine. So I see like the stealing is like taking like the essential techniques or something like that, or the spirit of the thing and making it your own and making it syncretic, making it adapted to who you are in your time and place. So I think that's, you know, that's what we're not seeing so much of here because there's such a taboo against syncretism here in the Anglo West.
yeah. I mean, and meanwhile, there's like 25,000 offshoots of the Christian church and like snake handlers in Tennessee and this kind of thing. I mean,
Yeah.
the interesting thing to me, I've looked into what you're talking about quite a bit because it's a fascinating study for me. The interesting thing that I see, like when you're saying the Anglo-West, is I see a very specific correlation between Puritan derived
Yeah, yeah.
countries, specifically Puritan derived, because in Catholic countries this isn't even as much of an issue because Catholicism is incredibly syncretic, and so like Brazil for example. So I question whether that attempt to put cultural limit and boundary around everything is kind of a regurgitated Puritanism.
Yeah,
It
I
seems,
call it, I'm calling it neo-Puritanism,
yeah,
seeing
it's, I
it
mean,
in the left and the right.
and yeah, the ways in which, um, yeah, I mean, it's a fundamentally kind of guilt-ridden stifling that
Yeah, yeah.
bears a lot in common with the witch trial predecessors,
Dude,
from which it came.
I mean, the
Uh,
way I see it is it is like a product of the colonial mind.
yeah,
It's
100%.
still setting up boundaries, even though like the way I've been thinking about it recently, and maybe this is the first time I've said it out loud in public, and it could ruffle some feathers, let's say, but I see it as a kind of like inverted white supremacy.
Yeah,
Do you get what
yeah.
I mean by that?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I
Yeah.
think, the colonial mind is incredibly confused. And it's particularly confused in this region of the world because, and by that I mean like North America, Australia. It's particular, but we'll stick with North America for now. It's particularly confused in this region of the world because the colonial mind is the mind of, on the one hand, yes, like limitations and boarding schools and strict rules around this and that, and like you can't do this and you can't do that, and stifling corsets and this whole restriction of culture. But the colonial mind is also coming through the people who were escaping all that and saying, we can do whatever we want. Look, we've landed in the shores of, this. like, uninhabited quote unquote land, and we get to do whatever we want whenever we want. And the colonial mind can't decide whether it is like, it wants to grant itself infinite permissibility on the one hand, but then it's like, oh, no, 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 you can't do that. But like, oh, but my freeform circle permits me to do everything. And like, it's in this
Yeah,
crazy
yeah,
pendulum swing
yeah,
between, what it allows itself to do and what it feels that others shouldn't do.
yeah.
And the
There's this,
entire dichotomy between freedom and order is a
yeah.
colonial dichotomy. The
It's so,
entire thing is this is what my entire next episode is about, just so you know.
okay, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
here we go, tapping into the same
Yeah.
stream, right? Like,
Exactly.
but there's something just so fucking like morally paradoxical about the whole kind of, and like when Trump invoked Manifest Destiny, like that's the heart of the colonial mindset is
Yeah.
like unfettered expansionism and entitlement, right? But at the same time, being so strict about limitations on certain things,
Right.
you know, really having to do with religion and
Right.
moral precepts around that. But yeah,
Well,
it's
but
just so
and both
bizarre.
sides of the political spectrum do both of these things. Both sides of
Yeah.
the political spectrum at this point are like, "Oh, you guys have to totally lighten up about it. Why are you so uptight about this particular set of things?" And then like in the next breath, it's like, "Oh, but we have to have restrictions around this, and that." And like yes, there's always a dance around these kind of things, but the fact that it can't see, like that the left and the right can't see that, it swings between, you know, an ethos of complete permissibility and an ethos of utter and total restriction, and that both sides of that swing are the definition of coloniality. It's like, it's like,
But the fact that the left can't see it, I did a podcast recently with Rob Hopke, who's a gay Catholic Jungian in San Francisco. So he's a great guy to talk to because
yeah,
he knows about limitations, but he's also very open,
yeah,
in a lot of ways. But it came up in our conversation, and I named it secular Puritanism.
mm,
And that's what I see in the left. It's not bound by religious moral precepts, but it's bound by these secular moral precepts. And
yeah,
yeah, both sides, it's like they're kind of inverse images of each other in terms of the freedom and restriction thing. And yeah, it's so fucked up and confused.
yeah. I mean, yeah, and the fact, honestly, for me, coming from someone who I think probably like you has deep what you could call progressive values, but the fact that the left can't see it about itself is more concerning to me almost than the fact that the right can't see it about itself. Because I don't
Well, the
think the
right, it's
right,
fully on display and it's
right,
upheld as a
exactly.
virtue.
Yeah,
Yeah, but will they ever take a critical look at it? And I don't think either side will. And I think that's part of the problem of being a polarized person or succumbing to ideology as a way to define oneself and find meaning, which is like the core of what we've been talking about, right? Like what brings people to your podcast, what brings people to exploring different traditions and all of that.
yeah, and it's interesting for me because I talk about these things and I storytell around them, and I do work to re-enchant. I mean, that's part of what I feel the work of the podcast is, and it comes with a lot of music and takes people on this kind of spiraling journey. Um, but I'm also aware of like within that, like we have to address this divide because the fact that something is working to re-enchant doesn't mean that it's working to take us into this space of like total anything goes, right? What it means is that it's working to take us into this space of like depth again, depth. And so on the one hand, there's the anything goes, like I get to do whatever I want, right? Like people don't consider that the fact that they want access to the highest yoga tantra, that they want access to the secret mantra, they don't consider that that could be colonial. They think that's like bringing down those rules and restrictions and stuff like that. And it's like, No, the part of you that wants to like say, hey, I'm the special one that doesn't have to go through the initiatory process and like can have access to X, Y, and Z, like that's where we might need to look a little bit deeper, right? And then
Mm,
on the other side of the spectrum, what you're talking about, the people who are like creating these just like completely fabricated and manufactured walls around culture. And again, this isn't, I'm not talking about the walls that indigenous people themselves are setting like around their traditions. That's something totally different. But like, I've heard people, supposed progressives saying things like, you should only practice a tradition that is from people of your bloodline. I mean, like,
mm,
what is that? I grew up in a Zen Buddhist household. My parents' teacher studied in Japan in a tradition that absolutely positively wanted that tradition to move to the West. In India, like I've been fortunate enough to study and meet people who are completely wanting people to come and study those traditions respectfully, right?
mhm,
There's a respect key, of course, but it's like so many, the Afro-Brazilian traditions are incredibly open. They're
mhm.
incredibly open. And if you ever want to bend a modern neo-Puritan North American mind, take them to an Umbanda circle in Brazil where they're going to see
I wish.
European descended Brazilians channeling, black spirits, and that'll
Caboclos and
throw that'll
mhm.
throw them into a complete like total
Yeah,
worldview
with a
tizzy,
Star of David on the wall and
Yeah.
a kind of Roman Catholic cross and a Black Madonna and a Ganesha.
Yeah.
It's
And
like, well, the way one of the reasons why I like this, when I'm talking about DIY shamanism versus creating your own religion, is I like that shamanism is always artistic, always adaptable, and always like eminently practical. Like you
Mhm.
said, it's about using what's available to you because like we're in desperate times and we need all the help we get. So if I'm in a trance state and Jesus shows up and offers me some healing, it's like I'm gonna take it, man. But if Ganesh shows up and offers to like help break down some boundaries for me or whatever, I'm not going to turn him away because he's not of my bloodline. And like picking from your bloodline is like that's a real problem for us, European mutts. It's like, well, which one do I choose from? Do I choose from the Irish bloodline or the Germanic bloodline or the Scandinavian bloodline or the French bloodline? Because all those are coursing through my veins, and who knows what else?
Yeah, and it's also it's not so clear in I mean, in certain indigenous traditions, yes, it's clear. But in a lot of traditions, it's not so clear. It doesn't go that far back. You look at certain deities in India that, have only been around in certain places for several hundred years. And, I talked about like, the deep Lakota relationship with the Black Hills in that region of South Dakota. I mean, that's a profound relationship, but do people know that the Lakota moved there fairly recently? Like that's not actually this relationship that goes back tens of thousands of years? Yeah,
Mm,
like if we start to unpack cultural tradition, we start to see more and more like this is a constantly adaptive, evolving, beautiful process that doesn't lessen its depth whatsoever. And I've seen, you know, this is where I feel that like devotion comes into it. I mean, you sing a song, you stand in a place you've never stood before and sing a song to that mountain, and if you're coming from a humble heart and you're wanting to reconnect and you're feeling the pain of disconnect of, your ancestors who moved across the world, you know, that those spirits there are gonna start humming in response. They're
mm,
going to start humming in response. It's like the animate force. But like, again, this is when you say secular Puritanism, that's a perfect description of it because the whole thing is that we're trying to put human gates and boundaries around things that ultimately, you know, it's human estimations around something that is mysterious and larger than us and of nature. And if
Mm.
you actually believe that there is an animating force or power or spirit or goddess or god that moves through land and manifests in different ways in different places, then we don't control like exactly who can say. I mean, the Indian traditions are full of stories of that spirit arriving to people it wasn't supposed to arrive to. You know, the
Yeah.
king has this grand festival that's going on. He's like, we're going to install Shiva in the temple tomorrow. And guess what? Shiva is with the, poor fisherman on the outskirts of town in his humble little hut. Or Andal, like, who's given the garland to put around her own neck instead of around Vishnu's neck. Like, she
Mm.
wasn't supposed to do that. And yet now her songs are sung like 1500 years later. They're still singing her songs.
Mm.
It's an evolving creative process. To me, like on for those who would kind of take it more to the freeform side, it's like encouraging depth, encouraging respect and depth. And then for those who would take it to the more limiting side, it's like take a look around, open your eyes, look at how this stuff shifts and evolves, and look at how it might not be humans that are determining all this, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and that gets into whole other things. Like if you're a like Tibetan practitioner of Tantra, if you're a Tibetan tantric practitioner, and you're of the heart and mind that human beings reincarnate over and over and over and over and over again, you know full well that like bloodline is only one aspect of.
There's only one line. Yeah.
Yeah. And there are stories within the Tibetan traditions, dozens of stories of like, you know, oh, so and so came from such and such land, and or so and so was reincarnated in this realm, and this kind of thing. And it's not bound by bloodline really whatsoever.
Yeah.
So
These
yeah,
superficial markers, skin color, eye color, hair color, that kind of
yeah,
thing. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, it's about respect and depth and the more than human drivers of what is ultimately a creative animistic process unfolding over time. Because that's who the goddess is. The goddess is particularly malleable and adaptable. She rises over here as Kali, she rises as the Black Madonna. She arises as a piece of driftwood in Brazil that becomes Senora Aparecida, right? Like
Yeah.
she shifts and morphs and changes. And, every so often the larger powers that be say, "Oh, well, you can't do this and you can't do that, and there's only this way to, access." And then she finds ways to morph and change, and we have to be open to that creativity while understanding the depth of, foundation and relational protocols that tend to work for people who want to access her. You know,
That's
that's how I
great,
would
man. Great
that's
place
how
to
I would
leave
put
it.
it.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a good one. Um, I think we covered everything I wanted to talk about. That's awesome. And just
Cool.
kind of we followed the flow.
This was
Now you,
actually really helpful because so this episode I'm doing a series and it's called "Is It Time to De-Decolonize?" and
oh, dude,
it's about a lot of this stuff. And I was going through a little bit of a like, oh my God, are people ready for this?
I
Yeah.
felt, I feel the
And
same thing with some of the stuff I've been putting out recently, but like I've just, I turned 50 a few months ago and I just think like I don't give a fuck anymore. Like if
yeah,
somebody comes after me because I'm using the term shamanism, it's like I got my rebuttal, okay? But like
yeah.
you're
I
also
mean,
it's just too dumb of a critique for me to even deal
yeah.
with at this
the
point.
whole
We're in
sha the whole
desperate
shamanism
times.
thing is like, well, the word shamanism only comes from Siberia. It's like, yeah, okay, the word shaman like only comes from Siberia. And you want to go through the laundry list of criteria that we don't have a better word. So like,
Yeah,
that
yeah, it comes with an asterisk. Okay, do I really have to repeat that every time I use it?
no,
But also, have you looked at the English language that you're speaking right now? It's a syncretic fucking appropriative
no,
language,
totally. Yeah.
you know? And there's one person who called me out. I remember they called themselves a psychotherapist. I'm like, do you
Yeah.
understand where those words come from?
Right. And yeah. And
It's just dumb. Small-minded.
I mean the Rig Veda, the Bible has Tamil words in the Bible. There are Tamil words in the Bible.
Hmm.
right? There are words that came from the Dravidian cultures in South India that made their way into the Aramaic and biblical scriptures. People have been syncretizing forever. Like, like when people kind of get into that cultural wall uh, argument, I'm like, you're about 2,500 years too late. I mean, like, like go to northern India where the Silk Road kind of dips into Ladakh, and it's like you have Greek descended people practicing Buddhism, and it's like, yeah, it just it can get really silly. Um, yeah, the
Well,
thing that I'm
and the kind of
just
ironic thing about it is it's like they're being actually like the ultimate gatekeepers because they're trying to gatekeep the sacred, right?
and
And
they're
these are the
often
same people who complain about gatekeeping, right?
right. They complain about gatekeeping when it doesn't apply to them. I don't know if you want to keep this part in because now we're kind of just kvetching, but like, like, yeah, they complain
Maybe
about
subscriber only content.
they complain about gatekeeping when it impinges on their right to do whatever they want whenever they want, but they're totally fine with pointing out other people's, gatekeeping. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a discourse situation, but the simplicity of what I'm kind of working at this episode is uh understanding exactly what we're talking about around, like, if you really want to deepen into foundation and tradition, then you have to be willing to look at boundary and limit. Like
Yeah.
you have to be willing to look at structure, and you actually even have to be willing to look at structural hierarchy,
You have to
which
look
is
at the structures in your mind, which are a product of the colonial mind. And like, so decolonizing starts with decolonizing your own mind,
mm,
which is all this stuff about boundaries and taboos and don't go there's and this kind of inverted white supremacy is like the secular Puritanism. Um,
mm,
so start there, please. Save
yeah,
us from the hassle of trying to explain things to you.
yeah,
I'm
um,
glad you're doing it, tackling that one.
yeah,
Might
yeah.
upset some of your listeners, though.
Yeah, it might. I
That's
mean,
okay.
I go into this whole thing about hierarchy too, which is like, if you imagine that the decolonial or pre-colonial state has no hierarchy in it, you haven't looked at many indigenous traditions.
Yeah.
Like, you know,
You definitely
and
haven't been in any like indigenous ceremony where there's like it's all protocol and
yeah,
hierarchy and yeah, different
yeah,
like levels of respect.
yeah,
Yeah.
totally. And times in which, you're ready for certain knowledge and times in which you're
Mm.
not, and all of that. Um, so I'm going down this kind of nature rabbit hole into like looking at relational and hierarchical systems within the structure of nature, and there's a lot of humor in it, so I'm hoping that'll help the medicine go down easier.
Yeah. I mean, geez, isn't that what Jordan Peterson did? Was like justify hierarchy by looking at lobster society or something like that.
Yeah, but I'm doing it in a slightly different way
I
because
hope so.
like um, again, it's this pendulum swing in the modern world, that pendulums between, you know, faceless, soulless, top-down hierarchy, and everything has to be a giant flattened consensus circle. And if you look at traditional systems, they're neither of those things. There are centralized organizing structures that maintain their accountability, and even, you know, like mandalas will shift, and what occupies the center at one point will then occupy the periphery for other decision making situations. And there's just a lot more depth than, you know, I think the progressive world needs to really go deep around organizing structure in a way that it's been good at saying, like, we don't want that. It's been good at saying, like, topple what currently exists. But I think that it oversimplifies, like, okay, these principles of egalitarianism, these principles of interconnectedness, how do we come up with organizing structures that actually build a healthy relational whole? And it's not
Mm.
as easy as simply saying flatten everything. It's
Yeah.
Yeah,
And what inevitably happens, and I see this all the time here in the on the West Coast in like transformational circles, is it's like the old psychological rule, like the return of the repressed in some monstrous form. So what ends up happening is power and hierarchy go into the shadow, and they emerge in these covert ways, which are like
exactly.
passive aggressive structures. And yeah. And it's like, God, can you not see what you're enacting here with your kind of subtle, oppressive language and forcing people to talk a certain way and not say certain things? I mean, it's the same thing, just in
Mm.
a slightly different form.
Yeah, or it ostensibly has like, a completely completely egalitarian organizing structure, quote unquote. But I mean, similar to what you're saying, it's like, that hasn't eliminated the actual very real, tangible dynamics of power that exist within that system. And, you know, what that calls for is to have an actual organizing structure of accountability as opposed to pretending that if we just name it up front and say that everything's kind of it's all good and it's all equal and there's no power differentials here, um, that actually addresses the fact that there actually are power differentials. And again, like the spirit world in a lot of traditional, there are power differentials in the spirit world.
Hmm.
There are forces that you could say. I mean, in the Tibetan traditions, they're even called like the landlords of certain spaces, right? And the shaman, part of what the shaman is doing, is understanding a particular, you can use the word hierarchy, like understanding a particular hierarchy of relationships that exists within that place and working within that to alchemize it. If you don't understand that at all and you just kind of, feel that like, oh, hey, I'm allowed to jump in because everyone's allowed to jump in. Like when you're talking about plant medicine spaces, you can get smacked down pretty hard. You can get smacked down pretty hard. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, it's a replenishment of our relationship with boundary, limit, and structure. It's not like a, valorization of the like horrid authoritarian structures that have, made up the modern world. But nor is it a valorization of kind of a hyper idealized, like, let's just get rid of everything, Yeah.
Yeah. That kind of like all or nothing thinking to me is just unsophisticated or immature.
Yeah.
And maybe that's just like where the cultural movement is, like that it's a fairly young movement and still hasn't grown up, you know? But to recognize that would, of course, require some humility, which puts us back to where we began. Why every sweat lodge requires you to get down on your hands and knees and crawl into a little hole.
Yeah, I've been missing that. I've been missing I've been missing that. Just like, yeah, being returned to our place
Mm.
over and over and over again. And
I've
it's
been
it's
craving that too, man. I thought I was done with like kind of going to the jungle and stuff. It's been like 5 years or yeah, a little more, and I just recently found myself just not necessarily going for ayahuasca, but just that experience,
mm,
in some way. I don't know, maybe I just got to get out into the ocean.
mm. Yeah, the ocean has a lot to say about limit.
Yeah,
Even
respect.
and even as it invites us into that oceanic space, it also reinforces like our place within it, and that's part of the beauty of the animate. Part of the beauty of opening up to nature is that we can be simultaneously drawn into the ecstatic vastness, even as we're reminded of our boundaries and limitations.
Yeah, I just had the image of me floating in the ocean and feeling that oneness, like the salt water in my body being no different than the salt water in the sea. And so I'm floating, looking up at the blue sky, and then an orca coming along and just swallowing me up. Remind me of just like a little cork bobbing in the ocean, a little
May it not be
morsel.
so.
All right, man, this has been really
Cool.
good. Well,
Yeah, great to talk with you.
yeah,
Um,
are you doing circles with Pia, these song and storytelling circles? Is that an
Pia,
ongoing thing with Pia?
um, Yeah, we've done a few live circles together, and then she comes to the course that I teach and guest story tells and stuff too.
In
But
virtual space?
yeah, in virtual space, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to sit in on one of those.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, we I'm gonna talk with her. It would be nice to offer another like short form offering to that's open to everybody
Hmm.
at some point. She's amazing. So it's like it's a joy to work with her. I mean, it's just like the yeah, when she opens her mouth to sing, it's like everything starts to hum along and all that I'm talking about seems to suddenly make sense.
Yeah.
So,
Hey, if we got a minute, I mean, this is a great time to ask about like putting some of this into practice, hierarchy, boundary, limits. So if you're working with these gatherings, circles, events, whatever, what are you doing up front to clarify any of those things? The boundary, the container.
yeah, you mean just in those like storytelling circles?
Yeah, like is it just like a egalitarian free for all, or are you clear about kind of limitations up front about,
Well,
sh
I mean,
sharing or
there's
yeah.
different types of offerings that I have, and if it's just a simple like story tell with some music, then generally it's pretty open, just like going to a concert would be. Yeah.
Mm.
Now, like in the
So it's
longer
more of
course,
a performance type of thing than a ritual.
yeah, yeah,
Hmm.
it's
Okay.
more of a yeah. I mean, performance is an interesting word. It's it's certainly a storytelling and musical journey that could take one into sacred and altered states of consciousness. But it's
Yeah.
also not like, and now we do this part of the ritual, and now we do this part of the ritual. The long form, I mean, it's very much aligned with what we're talking about today. The long form courses that I teach, I make incredibly clear up front that I'm not like initiating people into a spiritual tradition or that really the heart of it is to understand what we've been talking about today, which are foundations and commonalities in how cultures approach this. And in understanding those commonalities, then we can do basic practices together that have been practices that human beings have practiced across cultures forever. So, there's nothing appropriative about taking a simple drum and tapping it in a steady rhythm and doing that for quite a long time until one starts to feel connected to the larger than human world. Those
Hmm.
types of practices, they're really, like we talked about when we start looking at it, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of them that are common across global tradition. So the courses I teach are invitations for people to deepen their understanding of human ritual technology, you could say, to deepen their understanding of storytelling technology, mythic technology, ritual technology. And within that, I put up what I consider to be a lot of safeguards around really making sure it's understood that, you know, this is not a lineage, I'm not a guru, and I'm not, initiating or um, like bestowing anything on anyone. I'm simply offering what I've studied over many, many years.
Hmm.
Now, in the practice traditions that I've practiced over the years, that's when things get different. When you're in an actual, initiatory lineage, then there's times when you hear certain things, and if you want to hear certain things, you may have to deepen into your practice a little bit more. And if you want to
Put in the
receive
time. Hmm.
teachings, you might have to put in the time, and that's a whole different thing. So somebody actually asked me like, "Oh, is this course of yours? Is this like a mystery school?" And I was like, "No, it's not a mystery school. It's what you could call the like foundational prep that you might want to like know and embody before you then go to find the mystery school."
Hmm.
Um, I think a lot of people are trying to offer mystery schools in a very open kind of online format, and from my experience, that
Pay to
doesn't always,
play mystery schools.
yeah, pay to play mystery
Yeah.
schools. And from my experience, that doesn't always work so well.
Yeah, come on. Understatement of the
Well,
10,000 years.
I would close us by kind of winding it down a little bit instead of stoking the fire even more. But yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Oh, that sounds great. I love your kind of attitude and approach to that. Now, all of that said, because of the intimate nature of your podcast, it's your
yeah,
voice, a lot of it, and
yeah.
recorded in a very kind of high fidelity way. And so it gives people that ASMR, he's in my ear, he's in my head thing.
Mm,
You got to deal with people having like a ongoing parasocial relationship with you before they show up at your virtual doorstep. Where you're offering this kind of mystery school kindergarten, like here's something that's going to help orient you and give you like a good foundation so you can go out and find your path or whatever.
mm.
How do you deal with that? Do you do that consciously or do you just kind of, I mean, the way that you present yourself in our conversations, it would be very hard for me to project the guru onto you because I think you're just a relatable, humble dude, sincere student and got depth and all of that. But you don't seem to me someone who is trying to promote yourself as an authority or teacher. I mean, you're a teacher, obviously, but you know what I mean, like a guru
Yeah,
type.
yeah. I mean, I'm a teacher in that I've studied a lot of stuff and I really want to share it. And but I'm not a teacher in the sense of like I am a teacher and
Yeah.
you know, and
You got a
and like
t-shirt, not a robe on.
yeah, and I mean, I joke that if I ever feel that anyone is projecting like any kind of guru stuff on me, I usually will like tell a coyote story about like flinging poo or like tell the story of when I had to pull like half digested diapers out of my dog's butt after it got into my kid's diapers. I mean, like,
Yeah.
yeah. There and that is a little bit of what a good friend of mine would call spiritual jujitsu, which is that there are very conscious ways to deflect, and I work those ways constantly, and I try to make it extremely clear. Um, I grew up in the spiritual world, and I grew up in a spiritual tradition, and thankfully, I grew up in a spiritual tradition that, relatively speaking, was fairly healthy. It had its own political, you know, struggles, but it didn't
Hmm.
have like the kind of crazy abuse scandals that went on in other spiritual communities. But from a very young age, I've seen the dark side of spiritual communities. I've seen the dark side of the guru world. Um, I got my like rock star yayas out when I was went during in the 90s,
Hmm.
like we were talking about. Like I got my rock star yayas out in the 90s, and now I'm really mostly concerned with, telling enchanting story that hopefully resonates with people and sets them on a path that's meaningful in their life. And I don't want to be the center of that. I want to be a facilitator, and what I want to help facilitate is the voice of the animate itself in whatever way that I can, and just help give voice to it in a way that reverberates and resonates. And so I try to
Yeah.
keep it clear, and I also try to keep my life practice, like really, really simple. I'm not doing, you know, crazy neo-tantric stuff. Like, no offense to all my neo-tantric listeners, but like,
Yeah, and much to the chagrin of your wife. If only he was more like Sting.
Actually, I'm sure she's very relieved that I'm not more like Sting, but
Yeah, I
like,
know.
no offense to Sting either. But I just try to keep it all
It's
really
6
simple.
hours. Come on, honey. I got a baby to change. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's great, man. I feel like a lot of kinship with you. Even like the rock star comment. It's funny because a lot of the kind of the bad gurus that I've seen and I see out there, I just look at them and I think, well, that's somebody who really wanted to be a rock star who just couldn't play when they were younger, right? And like you, I had my rock star years and that was great. It's like I sowed those oats, and so I don't need to be some kind of like teacher authority rock star. Yeah,
yeah,
it's a
not
good
at all.
point.
Not
Yeah.
interesting. I don't find it interesting. I find it, what I find really
What a
interesting.
burden it would be.
Yeah,
Yeah.
what I find the most interesting is like peace of mind and heart, like the
Yeah.
simplicity of peace of mind and heart. And within that container of peace of mind and heart, there is room for beautiful and ecstatic explorations of the cosmic and the ecological. Um, but like it's another thing about the alchemy of the path. It's like if you're on the alchemical path, like, you know, a sign of someone who is on the alchemical path is like, you know, um are some of those rilings up over years and years and years starting to get tempered a little bit.
Yeah,
And
totally.
you know, when I was young, I didn't want to hear the word tempering at all. Like, don't tell me to temper myself. Like,
Yeah,
you know, and now I can look and say, like, there's nothing like a good tempering. There's nothing like, you know, crawling on one's knees in the sweat lodge. There's nothing like being brought to one's knees in the forest again, you know, at the altar of all this. Because we're passing, we're fleeting, you know. Let's
yeah,
keep it simple while we're here.
nice. Yeah, humility and humor, I always say, are good signs of someone who's been through it enough. You know, if you come out the other side humble and with a sense of humor, I think that's a sign of like spiritual depth and health.
Mm.
So you got both those things, which I appreciate.
Doing the best I can. Thank you.
Yeah, me too,
And
brother.